Guys, we continue with chapter 6, and we are talking about elasticity and tax incidence in this video. Remember, when tax is imposed on the market, the tax is shared between buyers and sellers on the market. And exactly the way is shared between buyers and sellers on the market, it's going to be depending on elasticity. So in the previous video, we had that market for pizza or ice cream, and buyers paid 30 cents more for the product after tax was imposed, and sellers were receiving 20 cents less for for the product that they were selling. So why it is exactly working this way? So once again, it depends on elasticity, and let's look at this scenario where supply is going to be more elastic than demand. So if we are talking about more elastic supply, think about it from previous chapter. Do I need to draw that supply relatively steep or relatively flat? Remember, elastic supply, do I need to draw it relatively steep or relatively flat? It have to be relatively flat, isn't it? And then demand, I'm going to make it, less elastic or more inelastic. So I'm going to draw demand curve relatively a kind of, steep. So now I'm going to impose a tax on the market. Let's suppose I'm imposing a tax on the market. And remember, it doesn't matter if we impose tax on buyer or on seller, okay? We just impose this tax I showed you in the previous video, and we are saying that, or we know that the upper portion of the tax is going to be price that buyers are paying, and lower portion of the tax is going to be price that sellers are receiving. Okay, now we're going to look at that and try to determine who is paying greater burden of the tax. Guys, remember, this is our equilibrium. This is our initial price equilibrium before we impose the tax on the market. Remember, when we had this equilibrium price, buyers, they paid this price, sellers, they kept this money. Now, when we impose the tax on the market, something is going to change. Do you see this is the amount of the tax? Do you see how this amount of the tax is shared between buyers and sellers? So this is the amount of the tax. So how is it shared between buyers and sellers? Well, if I actually should have been more precise, that's probably over here. That's the price that sellers are receiving. So do you see that from this equilibrium, price that buyers are paying increased actually by a lot, and price that sellers are receiving decreased only by a little bit, because this is the tax, this is the amount of the tax. From initial equilibrium before we impose the tax, price that buyers are paying increased by a lot, but price that sellers are receiving actually decreased by a little bit. Why it is so? Since we have relatively elastic supply, sellers have alternatives. They can freely leave the market. They're saying, you know what? I don't have to produce what I'm producing right now. I can rearrange my facilities and produce something else really easily. Instead of hamburgers, I can produce pizzas. Or instead of pizzas, I can produce hamburgers or hot dogs. So therefore, they can really easily leave the market. Versus, for buyers, they're saying, well, you know what? We want this product, okay? This is a necessity. This is a short term. We cannot really freely leave the market, okay? So therefore, we're going to share this greater burden of the tax. And pizza and probably hamburgers were not the best example, sorry. So but that's why buyers are going to pay more of the burden of the tax here. Okay, so now in the next one we're going to reverse. Let's suppose we have markets for the same product. We have price and we have quantity. We have, and we have supply and we have demand. And what are we going to do? We're going to reverse. Our demand right now is going to be more elastic. So if demand is more elastic, it means I need to draw this demand relatively flat. Supply is going to be less elastic. Remember, it means that supply is going to be more inelastic. So, and I'm going to put this equilibrium price over here, price equilibrium. Remember, this is the price before the tax, and now I'm going to impose a tax on the market. I'm imposing a tax on the market. Do you see that price that buyers are paying? Price that buyers are paying increased only by a little bit, but price that sellers are receiving decreased by a lot. So this is because we have inelastic supply. Inelastic supply means sellers don't have too much alternative. They cannot rearrange their facilities from producing, cars to producing boats. It's hard for them. They're saying, you know what, we're going to take this heat and we're going to pay this greater burden of the tax. Versus buyers saying, you know what, you impose tax on this product, I can freely leave the market. So therefore, they're paying only a little bit of the tax. So once again, the tax you see over here, this is the tax, or we can say this is the tax, and it's split because initially this is what price that the buyers are paying was equal to the price that sellers are receiving. So price that buyers are paying increased only by a little bit, price that sellers are receiving decreased by a lot. So sellers do not have that much alternative. Now, guys, looking at this kind of both scenarios, what kind of conclusion are we going to make? Remember, in the previous example, supply was like that, and demand was relatively inelastic. If I'm going to do this price equilibrium and I impose a tax over there, remember, this is my demand curve. Remember, that was price that buyers were paying, and that was price that sellers are receiving. What kind of conclusion are we going to make from these two cases? Who is paying greater burden of the tax? You see here we have inelastic supply. Sellers were paying greater burden of the tax. Here we have inelastic demand. Buyers were paying greater burden of the tax. So the conclusion is going to be that greater burden of the tax falls on the market with lower elasticity, or the one that is more inelastic. Remember, if it is inelastic, it means lower elasticity. So I'm going to make this conclusion here, that greater burden of the tax falls on the side of the market with lower elasticity or that side, the side that is less elastic or more inelastic. So therefore, it's all depend on the curve. All right, I think, oh, and guys, one more thing in this chapter. So since you already know how the, elasticity and tax burden related, let's look at this case study. So in 1919, Congress decided to impose a tax on the luxury product. So they said that, well, you know what, those people who can afford this luxury product, okay, private planes, furs, jewelry, expensive cars, it means that they can afford paying more taxes. And they said, well, we're going to, create more revenue if we're going to increase, okay, taxes on the luxury product. Remember, for the luxury items, think about the elasticity. If we're talking about from the buyer's point of view, okay, demand, okay, for luxury items relatively elastic because you increase the price, okay, or impose a tax on those luxury goods. Buyers are going to say, I can freely leave the market. I don't need to buy that product because I can get by without it. Supply is going to be relatively inelastic because if I'm producing yachts, I cannot freely leave the market and start producing, I don't know, some kind of pizzas or something like that. It's going to be hard for me to do that. Or private planes, if I'm producing these private planes, I cannot rearrange my facility really quick and producing some kind of item that you're not taxing right now. So therefore, demand is going to be relatively elastic, supply is going to be relatively inelastic. Now, we need to think about who ended up paying this luxury tax. Remember, we wanted to collect it from buyers most likely, isn't it? Because buyers, they have of those luxury products, they actually have more money. Let's look at this. So let's look what happened on the market for luxury products. And exactly what we look over here is the market for luxury yachts. So remember, once again, supply is going to be relatively inelastic because we cannot, as a sellers, freely leave the market. The demand curve is going to be relatively elastic. Here's the price, remember, with no tax, and then we impose any tax on this market. Just see over here, how is this burden of the tax shared between buyers and sellers? Since buyers can freely leave the market, it's a luxury product. I don't have to buy it. Impose a tax, I can leave. I can get by without it. So buyers paying only a little burden of the tax. Again, because demand is relatively elastic. I have another alternative. I don't have to buy this product. Versus supply, when I'm producing yachts, I can rearrange my facilities and all of a sudden producing cars or the product that actually not taxed. So therefore, I have to stay on the market. If I'm staying on the market, I am willing to pay this greater burden of the tax. Do you see that portion of the tax that sellers are actually paying and portion of the tax that buyers are actually paying? Relatively little. Now, you need to think about it. Guys, remember, we wanted to impose a tax on people or collect more taxes on people who have more money, because if you can afford this, luxury yachts, it means you have more money. Did we ended up doing that? And the answer is no, because those people who have a lot of money, they left this market, and the owners of the corporations and the main thing, people who worked and built those luxury yachts, all of a sudden they suffered the most. They're just regular workers. They're not rich people. They're middle class people, or maybe lower income class people, because all of a sudden, remember, demand for those luxury boats, remember, it's actually decreased. If we decrease the demand, what does it mean? Well, we're producing less. It means I'm not going to hire that many people. I'm going to have to let some people go. I'll probably have to decrease their wages or salaries. So therefore, when we increase the tax or impose a tax on those luxury goods, people in the middle class, they suffered the most. Once again, rich people didn't mean any burden. This is any harm. This is just how natural forces work on the market. Therefore, remember, your future lawmakers and stuff, your future of our country, you need to understand how this tax working on the market. You want to increase tax, like right now they're trying to do in New York, the tax, and they want to do it like close to like 62-65%. This is just insane. Okay, it's not going to work in the long term, and we already see in those states where they're trying to impose a higher tax, a lot of people, the producers, they just live in the states. Okay, and who is going to suffer from this? Those people who work in those companies. All of a sudden they're going to be without a job. All right, that's it for this chapter.